I'm going to plug my own job a little bit first. So I'm a fire prevention officer here in Lake of Bays, but I'm also a volunteer firefighter at Hillside. So I've been doing that for almost 8 years, and now I have a full-time job educating and doing prevention stuff, inspections, and doing the different things that prevention officers do. One of the things we do is we have a program. We're really lucky. The Baysville Curling Club provided almost 300 smoke alarms to our community, and they're not doing any good for me in my office. So I want to make sure that they get into people's homes. So if you're unsure whether or not you have working smoke alarms or carbon monoxide alarms, I want you to contact me. I have a bunch of business cards here. I can come and do a judgment-free assessment of your home. I can install them, and then I know for sure that you guys are safe. So I just want to make sure that that's something that you take advantage of. I've been in quite a few homes lately, and a lot of homes have expired alarms. So I just want to make sure that that doesn't happen to any of you guys. So yeah, so I have a checklist here that you can take a look at, and there's some daytime burning regulations here that you can take a look at as well. But enough about me. We're very privileged to have Ken Cox here today. He's an expert in Wildland Fire and FireSmart here in Canada. So he's got a wonderful presentation that you guys are lucky to see, and I'll bring it on to Ken Cox.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah. Thanks everybody having me. You don't have to clap. Oh, man. Okay, you can clap. Usually I don't get clapped. No, so thanks, Steve. That's amazing. I'm also a volunteer firefighter too for Algonquin Highlands, just down in the south. So for those of you that travel down Highway 35 through Algonquin Highlands, I'm the captain for one of those stations. Also, I've been on the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, Aviation Forest Fire Emergency Services branch. It takes me a while to get through that name. It's a long title. But I've been on with them for 16 years. I'm your provincial advisor for the province, specifically for Southern Ontario. So I look after basically the north side of Algonquin Provincial Park, all the way over to Henvey Inlet, First Nation, and all the way down south across. So large amount of municipalities, about 273 municipalities, about 33 First Nation communities, and all kinds of people I get to come out and speak to Wildland Fire Effects for. When I'm not presenting to the public, like tonight, I get to be on deployment all across Canada, in Northwest Territories, Quebec, anywhere in between, wherever there's a wildland fire and that host agency needs assistance, Ontario will send them resources, and I'm one of those resources that will go out and supply them assistance with. So yeah, with that, I'll talk about today a wildland fire overview, and we're going to talk about mitigation on how to better protect your own homes or structures that you have within forested areas from the unfortunate aspect of a fire department or the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry not getting there in time to protect said structure. Yes, go ahead.
As we get old and our memory's not as good, is this going to be available online, or should I be taking it?
Oh, you can ask Steve.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that before. We're actually filming this, and we'll be posting this online for everybody to be able to pass along to anybody that wasn't able to attend. Yeah.
So no pressure on Kenny. Just joking. All righty. Oh, and of course, right away, my clicker doesn't work. That's okay. There we go. I'll try and get the clicker working back there. So I like to start off a presentation with giving like an overview of the province, not just locally, but also nationally as well, because wildland fire demands agencies from international aspects right down to local municipal fire departments like you have here in Huntsville and Lake of Bays. So the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, through the Forest Fire Prevention Act, is responsible for wildland fire management in the province of Ontario north of this squiggly line. So anytime you hear the ministry speaking about wildland fire, we're only speaking to wildland fire north in northern Ontario, north of this squiggly line. Everything south of that is all municipal services. So the municipality of Vaughan, or city of Vaughan, I should say, Rockland, Clarence, you name them. There's 222 down here in the OFR. Everything north of this line in the province of Ontario, you're governed by that legislation that tells you can't have a campfire bigger than 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters when you're burning debris and whatnot like that. That's an overarching legislation, and it's up to each municipality to govern the bylaws in place that coincide with their best interests. So you might have from Lake of Bays, Steve, what is your campfire size? 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter-ish?
Yes.
It is? Okay.
Non-recreational, it's 2.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
But you have to be 100 meters away from anything combustible.
Okay, copy that. So each municipality has their own bylaws, right, that they govern burning with. And the ministry has an overarching umbrella that governs it as well. So 2 sets of legislation, pretty confusing for folks. When you get a restricted fire zone in effect, that's the ministry putting a burn ban in place. And the municipalities always follow suit. But there doesn't have to be a restricted fire zone in place for the municipality to put a burn ban in. So whenever you go out to go burning, make sure you're checking your local municipality because they'll know the answer right away. Makes sense? Just so everybody knows about burning. Now, let's talk about fire, because fire is pretty exciting to talk about. Pretty hot topic, if you will. Anyway, bum bum bum, bad dad joke, I know. The province of Ontario is a pretty large landmass, right? To provide an adequate response to the taxpayers and to the land base, it needs to be broken up into spans of control, manageable spans of control. So it's broken up into response sectors. And the response sectors each have a fire management headquarters located within them. And the fire management headquarters, so down here in the south, just south of the highway of you in Haliburton, holds the crews and resources to respond adequately to the normal fire load. There's nothing normal about wildland fire. Wildland fires, when they start to occur, you get multiple starts at a time and it gets escalated, and you'll see it on the news, right? It's escalated very quickly. That's where burn bans come into place and whatnot. But even when you have burn bans in place, we still receive in the ministry's line of work about 78% of our fires are lightning caused. So even if you have no human caused fires at all in the landscape, we still have wildland fires to manage on the landscape. So kind of interesting stat. Out of Haliburton Fire Management Headquarters, which is just down the highway from you, we respond all over this neck of the woods here, the north side of Algonquin Park, south side, and we'll even shoot off beyond. Because fires don't follow lines on maps by any means, we're always overlapping with other agencies, and we'll have Sudbury, it's nothing to have Sudbury, North Bay, Timmins, Cochrane, Hearst crews shoot down in a helicopter to come assist us, or for us to shoot up and help them when they have lots of fire on the landscape. Within this jurisdiction that we have, we also have municipal fire departments and First Nation community fire departments as well, right? As well as the Department of National Defense. The ministry is not the only entity that responds and suppresses fires. Our partnerships are integral. And for Steve's team, Ian's team, and Rob's team here for Huntsville, Lake of Bays area, it's integral for us to be able to call on them when we have lots of wildland fires that they respond to on our behalf, and vice versa. They'll call us for support when they need our support. It's a good partnership. That partnership transverses all across Ontario, and it also extends beyond Ontario's borders to BC, Northwest Territories, and all the way over to Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. Every province and territory in Canada is not the exact identical image to Ontario, but it's very close. And when BC is super hot and dry, like they were in 2020, 2017, 2023, we'll go over and assist them. Vice versa, in 2021, they all came and assisted us. We're very mobile. That being said, it also expands internationally as well. So it's nothing to have Mexico 20-pack teams come up, Australian teams, New Zealand teams, France, South Africa, you name it. A tremendous amount of other countries, and not excluding the States, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, California, they'll all come up and assist us, and vice versa, we assist them. So it's very much so a mutual aid and resource sharing abilities. Yes?
Am I allowed to ask?
Absolutely, you can.
I've always been curious about the mutual aid, and not necessarily you to another service, but another service to us, specifically Mexico, and you mentioned some other countries. When they come, obviously they have different standards of how to fight a fire where they are. How do you transition them from what they deal with in Mexico? I know they came last year.
Yep.
How do you transition them from that to what our standards may be? Is that a difficult thing to do?
No, that's an excellent question, and the answer is very quite simple. We all train to the same incident management system and incident command system that's recognized globally. That allows us to know who's the chain of command, who reports to who, and who takes order from who through an incident command structure. There are language barriers, 100%, and they'll come with translators, or we'll go with translators in those instances. But the instances, Wildland Fire's always trained through strategic training that really mirrors image globally. So when you're speaking to somebody about how to put out a fire with hand tools in France or Australia, they know exactly what you're talking about, and so do we in Canada, because it's the same core curriculum. Does that make sense? It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Tools we have. Everybody likes to see the tools that we have to bring to the table. You as Ontario taxpayer, you own 3 of these Twin Otters on floats. They're water bombers from 1964, incredibly versatile aircraft. They're smaller aircraft than the CO-415, but they pack a very good punch. And you'll see them down here in the Muskoka region, especially out of Haliburton or the Muskoka Airport, throughout the summer during times of escalation. You also have, of course, these water bombers. The CO-415 water bomber is our staple point. It's pretty well known across the world. Lots of other countries and jurisdictions have them. Ontario owns and operates 9 of them at the peak when all are operating. Its job and the Twin Otter's job are to scoop up water off of a lake, come around the side of a high intensity fire, and put out that fire's edge to reduce its intensity, reduce that fire's edge's intensity to allow boots on the ground firefighters, whether it be Huntsville, Lake of Bays firefighters, or whether it be Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry firefighters, to begin working up the flanks to contain that fire from continuing to spread outwards. And just like your question asked, that's how it's trained across the globe in terms of wildland fire response and how we do that with pumps and hose and hand tools. It can scoop up about 6,500 liters of water in 12 seconds. It's a lot of water. Now, if you're out and about on your lakes and you happen to see these coming in and they'll go over the lake low level and then they'll come back up, they're going to want to pick up. But they can't pick up unless the waterways are clear. So please, if you ever have them overhead and you think that they're looking to pick up because they go over the lake low level and they're doing a circuit to come back around, please get off to the side. They're not going to push anybody off the lake, obviously, but they're trying to warn you to get off the lake and to give them the waterway access. You can imagine here trying to put firefighters on this fire. This is a high intensity fire, and you got 30-foot trees with 90-foot flame lengths coming off of it. It's much too hot to put a firefighter on there, right? I won't make it. I'll perish, because we firefighters wear lightweight Nomex clothing. It enables us to get in and out and work in very hot and strenuous environments, climbing up hills, going through hills, getting soaking wet, climbing over rocks, debris, logs, and whatnot. But the Nomex doesn't protect us, or offers very little protection, I should say, from heat and flames. That's why we train through LACEs. It's called lookouts, anchor points, communications, escape routes, and safety zones. Sorry I rattled that off really fast, but it's a lot of information. And we train to be never in that predicament and always have an aviation assets to reduce the intensity enough that we can go in and mop it up and clean it up. Make sense? That's why you see those. How do we do that? We respond via helicopter about 90% of the time. Specifically down here in the south. Up north, it's probably 95% of the time they respond via helicopter. And that's because if you can think back to that map that I showed, Haliburton, where everything's located, there's a pretty big area. To be able to drive all the way to Chief Jack Bird over the North Bruce Peninsula, it takes me about 5 hours. To be able to drive all the way over to Pembroke side, it takes another 4.5 hours, almost 4 hours, especially on a calendar day long weekend with lots of traffic. Helicopters are integral for us to get a call from maybe Gary Monahan over here in Huntsville or Lake of Bays to say, hey, I got a fire, I need your assistance. Then we can zoom up, help him, get back down to Haliburton, refuel, re-personnel it up with more equipment, and then scoot over to the next call. The more fire calls we're getting, the more helicopters we get to meet that demand. Oh, this helicopter is actually pretty neat. It's called an EC-130. You as an Ontario taxpayer own 7 of them. And they're incredibly versatile aircraft in the fact that they hold a lot of our gear. You can see here a crew getting out in a standard fashion. The helicopter hovers while the crew gets out, just kind of drops off the side of it. We don't jump off the helicopter ever. That's a bad word for me to say, but you slide off the side of the helicopter, crew cuts a pad, cuts down any danger trees that are near it, and then we can touch down and unload the rest of the equipment. It's a very safe helicopter because down here in Southern Ontario, there's lots of pets running around. And when we arrive on scene, sometimes it attracts a lot of people, right? Because it's pretty exciting and people want to see it. The unfortunate side of that is pets getting loose and whatnot. And the nice thing about this aircraft is it's got a closed tail rotor, so no dogs can get sucked up into a tail rotor, and that's a bad day for everybody. But that's what makes this machine really nice and safely. Yeah. That's another reason why sometimes we can't land where we want to land, because of the public being there and dogs, and we can't predict if somebody's going to let their dog go or not by accident, right? So that's a whole other aspect of when you see us. It's great to take pictures and stuff and whatnot, but make sure you're back far enough away that we can just do our job safely without having anything get hurt. And there's lots of opportunity to take pictures and ask us questions after the fact, after we get down on the ground. Here's another helicopter here. That is a Wildcat Helicopters machine. Ontario hires out about 200 rotary wing helicopters on a busy season. That's a tremendous amount of aviation assets all across North America. 7 helicopters is a good fleet for us for a low fire load, but we hire out a tremendous amount of helicopters that supplement us with rotary wing assets when we need them. And these medium helicopters, we call them, they're larger helicopters, hold all 4 firefighters, the other one's on the other side unloading, a full unit of crew, but not just the crew and the people, and the resources, but it also comes equipped, some of them, with a belly tank. So it's dual purpose. Not only does it drop off the crews and resources, it also, when it's done dropping off, comes up, drops down its intake, sucks up about 250 gallons of water, goes over top of the fire, drops on it, and does that for a few circuits before going back to get the next crew. It's a very versatile machine that puts out a lot of fire on the landscape very quickly and effectively. So that's the tools we use. That's me. That's who I work for, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. You guys have a pretty good idea of who I am, where I come from now. Some of the tools that I bring to you when you call 911 and say, hey, there's a forest fire here. That's the helicopter flying overhead. It might be me. It's probably one of my colleagues. But why do we think about wildland fire? It's because we live in a forested and a landscape that has wildland fire reoccur on it naturally. It's a natural phenomenon, right? And it's always going to occur. To understand it, we look back to 2021, and for the sake of this presentation, I look back to 2021 because 2021 was a key point in terms of Ontario receiving the most hectares burnt in a fire season since 1995. And if you look back from there into 2022, 2023, which was a very busy year nationally, and then what 2024 might have in store, you can kind of connect dots and see patterns of trends and whatnot and cycles, right? So for 2021 stats, we had just over 1,200 wildland fires in the province of Ontario. Again, 78% of them were lightning caused. 22% of them back then were human caused. Of those 22%, that's not all just campfires that were left unattended. That accounts for trees on power lines, criminal intent, arson, cigarette butts out windows, you name it. Anything that's human associated, classified as human. Over 1,000 of those fires, we fully suppressed. We put those fires out because they're threatening something of human value. But you'll see here 140 some odd fires were monitored or modified. We allow a lot of fires to burn naturally on the landscape when they're not going to threaten anything of human value. Managing fire, to use the power of fire to benefit ecosystem restoration and ecosystem management for a variety of species, which I'll talk about in a little bit. In all, just over 800,000 hectares, or sorry, just under 800,000 hectares of forest in Ontario were affected by fire in 2021, which is just a bit bigger than the size of Algonquin Provincial Park, if you think of Algonquin Provincial Park. For those of you that are map savvy like me, all those fires for the most part occurred in northwestern Ontario, with quite a few still in the southern portion. That was only due to the way that the weather panel set up for the year. So fire is completely dependent on the weather. If it's wet and rainy, you don't get any fires, right? When it's dry like it was today and it's going to be tomorrow, those fuels start to dry out and they become more and more dry each compounding day you have of no rain. If you go a week without precip, you're going to be looking at burn ban or burning restriction possibilities, especially if we're starting to see fire starts. The way that the patterns developed in 2021 was a cool, dry Arctic air mass influenced northwestern Ontario and gave them very dry forests and made them very receptive to lightning starts. So we've seen a lot of fires up in the north, not so much down here. That can be flip-flopped. It just depends on the way that the upper atmospheric levels push weather and pull weather across Canada. Same for each province. 2022, not very much fire on the landscape, eh? But I want to talk about 2022 because it's actually really key in terms of what we're dealing with in the future. In 2022, you can think about the derecho storms and the tornadic events that unfolded all across central and southern Ontario. I don't know if that impacted anybody in here or not, but when I go and visit folks in the Madoc, Tweed, Limerick, Wallaston area along that Highway 7 corridor, they're extremely impacted by those tornadic events and heavy winds and microbursts. 2022 seen an increase in overall temperature. But the funny thing about an increased overall temperature is that doesn't mean that there's always going to be wildland fire associated with that. Wildland fire, although it is influenced by temperature, it's mostly influenced, more so influenced, I would say, by relative humidity. And relative humidity is the amount of moisture in that air. So if you had an air moisture content of 100%, you'll never get a fire to burn, even if the fuels are dry, because the oxygen that fire is drawing in is too wet to ignite. It's too wet to burn. Vice versa. If you had, and that could be like a temp of 30 degrees, but if you had a temp of 5 degrees, like today, and the RH was only 20%, like it was today, much more volatile day. Even though it's cooler out, the air is drier. So the dryness of the air outweighs the temperature of the air parcel in terms of fire behavior in general, as well as wind, of course. And that's why we didn't see a lot of fire in the landscape in 2022. It was very humid summer. Humidex values stayed high the entire summer. You go outside and work and you'd be sweating like crazy. But you ramp it up to 2023 and it was the exact opposite for most of Canada. So 2023 is hot on everybody's radar because last year it was the busiest fire season Canada's ever recorded in terms of records keeping. Sorry, I'm a firefighter, so when I say records keeping, I mean record keepings. But anyway, you know what I mean. For Ontario's averages stats, it's actually just below average, or right around average. It wasn't by any means a crazy busy year for Ontario specifically, but it absolutely was for British Columbia, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, all the other provinces and territories, Quebec included as well. One of the reasons of that is because of our Great Lakes and the Hudson's Bay and James Bays. When you have increases in temperature, you get a lot of lake effect. A lot of relative humidity builds off those big bodies of water that Ontario is, for all intents and purposes, surrounded by on two sides, whereas other provinces don't have that. That's why we don't see nearly as much fire on the landscape as compared to those western provinces, depending on the way the weather panels build for the season. It could all change. Winds can change stuff, and we could get just as much, if not more, fire on the landscape than BC, like in 2021, for example. So that brings us to 2024. So what do we have in store for 2024? Well, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but I have absolutely no idea. Yeah, I'm glad you all laughed because some people get, but anyway, I'll be able to tell you in November after the fire season happens. We have, us as humans, we got a really good technology that tells us, a cone of possibilities of weather outlook. I can tell you exactly what it's going to be in 10 minutes. I got a pretty good idea what it's going to be in 2 days. 3 days, I got a pretty good idea. Well, anything after 7 days, 10 days, who knows what it's going to be in all retrospect. So I've been doing this job for 16 humble years, which is a blink of an eye for many of you folks that have also been in fire services. And I can tell you, I've been told every spring what to expect, and I think only once they've ever been right. Yeah, so who knows what we're in store for this year. But I think we can all attest that we know fires have happened in the past. We know we've gotten pretty extreme fire occurrences in the past, especially locally too. And we got to prepare for those because we don't know what's in store. Could be a wet year, but it might not be. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Negative impacts from wildland fire. So why does that bother us? Well, because as humans, wildland fire pretty much always negatively impacts us in one way or another. It either burns down cell towers, hydro line corridors, closes off roads, shuts down railways, burns down, unfortunately, communities, right? As you've seen from Slave Lake in 2011, Fort McMurray in 2016. I could go on and list all the communities as well in the last few years since 2017. There's been a lot of devastating events unfold, unfortunately, from the impacts of wildland fire. And that's why there's a lot of emphasis to put them out, right? To suppress them, to get there fast and put water on them and reduce their intensity. The essence is we can't always be there on time. I think we've all learned that. I think everybody in this room can attest to that. When you call 911, Lake of Bays and Huntsville doing everything they possibly can to get to you, whether it's for cardiac arrest, whether it's for a motor vehicle collision, or whether it's for a wildland fire, right? We're doing our absolute best to get to you, but there are barriers in the way in terms of how fast we can respond sometimes, given different dynamics. Wildland fire is no exception. Wildland fires, I'm going to teach you how they grow so you can understand how fast they can have a blow-up condition or an escalated fire growth condition. But for all intents and purposes, in wildland fire management, the heat and the flames are only one aspect, one very little aspect in terms of its negative impacts to humans, and the other impact is all the smoke. Oh no, my thing went, here I'll just click it off and on. All the smoke, anyway. You can see, and you probably felt, a lot of smoke impacts from the fires in June, early June of last year. Did everybody have to deal with that? Yeah, you all seen it when you looked out your windows and doors and you felt those effects of the smoke. And that was predominantly due to this occurrence. What happened in Halifax after they had that devastating wildland fire event unfold in the southern portion of their province, they had a stationary low develop over top of it. And that stationary low, it just sits over top of a geographical region and it spins. And as that spins, it draws air, and it drew dry Arctic air. Even though it was cool, it was very dry. That fueled northern Quebec and some northern Ontario fires to grow very quickly and very large in a short period of time. And where did all that smoke end up? All that smoke was pushed straight down into, you guessed it, southern Ontario and the northern states, and then it impacted probably everybody here as well as a lot of your neighbors, right? That's how that developed. Typically, there is a lot of fire on the landscape in the north. There's always typically fires burning, especially in July and August, up in these areas of Quebec, northern Quebec, into the Labrador and then into Ontario. But typically the jet stream and the winds aloft are pushing the smoke out over top of the Labrador Sea, never to be seen and never to bother anybody. But last year was an exception where I've never seen it, and my predecessors, when I was on the phone with them talking about it, they've never seen it in their careers either, where it pushed all that smoke down to southern Ontario, hence impacting you all. So in case you're all wondering what was going on, that's the events that unfolded on us for last year, and how we had to deal with them was to try to manage the wildland fires that were occurring. But for all intents and purposes, smoke management, we call it smoke management, but the only way I manage smoke is if I light something on fire or I don't. You know, I can't really control the way that the winds aloft take smoke, and no agency really can. So we're at the mercy of that. That being said, I can't come and speak to you about fire and not talk about the positive effects of wildland fire. So it's critical, it's absolutely critical that we acknowledge the ecological role fire plays in the health of all forests and grasslands across North America, because it's happened for time immemorial. It's happened as long as there's been a blade of grass or something consumable on Earth that could get hit by lightning and could combust, there's been fire on the landscape. A number of species in Ontario specifically have evolved around the disturbance of wildland fire, and two of them, as which is a tree species which directly impacts the habitat for that endangered species of bird called the Kirtland's warbler. The Kirtland's warbler needs a jack pine forest of 15 to about 25 years of age stand to breed and nest in. It doesn't nest anywhere else in the world other than a forest that's at that high age. That forest is at that age because a wildland fire went through 15 or 25 years before and opened that serotinous cone and created that habitat for it. So if you eliminate fire, you unfortunately inadvertently eliminate that bird's habitat. Why that bird picks that, I don't know. I don't speak Kirtland warbler, but anyway, it does. And that's something as humans we have to take in consideration for all the other species that call this great land home, right? I took this picture in 2021. This is a fire called Kenora 51, and the Manitoba border is up along just the other side of the Kirtland's warbler. Actually, I'll back it up so you can see. And as I was coming around, that's about 25 or 30 kilometers of flame front backing towards the Manitoba border. And as I was coming around, you could see a jack pine forest that was immature but still growing. It was from a fire that happened in the 1980s. I don't know when the last time this burned. We'll just call it old growth. And then you had a fire here that you can actually see a little bit better because the resolution that happened in 2012. When fires come through, they don't just burn in a one solid line of destruction. They hop and skip and jump over lakes. They burn around swamps, and they create different patterns of mosaic habitat that benefit all the different species of Ontario, including the Kirtland's warbler, including species like woodland caribou, elk, moose, deer. I know we have lots of moose and deer down here in the south, but they do benefit from the effects of wildland fire. in capacities. So that's pretty cool, eh? That's the good side about wildland fire. We're the only species that have negative effects from wildland fire, aside from like trout and frogs and stuff like that. They don't benefit very much from fire, but all other species for the most part do benefit from it. So it's important as us as stewards of the environment and looking out for the environment that we look at ways to use the power of fire in a controlled setting to benefit that. And when we eliminate fire from the landscape, we look at ways to introduce it. So MNRF does a lot of prescribed burns. I just got off prescribed burns, hence why I got some poison ivy on me anyway. But we did 22 prescribed burns there on the last weekend there down the south. So happy to say that we get lots of fire on the landscape when conditions are low to moderate and we can control them in settings that ecologically benefit species. But of course then we return suppression, full suppression operations when the weather patterns give us moderate to high to extreme weather parameters that promote extreme fire growth. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's all based on the weather. So how do fires start and grow? This is going to connect all your dots, and I promise it's going to come right back around. I know I went way out in ecology land, but it's going to rope it right back in, and you guys are going to have a really good, wholesome view of wildland fire here in a moment. So fires only start because of three elements coming together: heat, oxygen, and fuel. The fuel has to be present and dry enough to combust. If it's always wet, it won't combust. Oxygen, we're not going to ever change. I hope we don't ever change that in the atmosphere, because that's kind of what we need to breathe. And heat could be anything from a lightning strike. It could be a cigarette butt that's discarded improperly. It could be criminal intent, arson, you name it. But when you combine those three elements of dry fuel, oxygen, and heat, it'll support combustion in a forested environment, like you see here in the photo. I took that photo, by the way, in 2022. Just so you know, I'm not pulling things from the internet. What's that? Yeah, I did actually. Yeah, that was for a prescribed burn. Yeah, so it's all legal. It's all legal. Don't go and do this unless you're a low complexity. Yeah, don't do this unless you're a low complexity prescribed burn boss, please. And then once that fire starts, it behaves on the environment around it. And that environment around it that drives fire is topography. So fires grow exponentially quicker upslope, because when a flame burns, the heat rises. On a slope, it preheats the fuels ahead of it. So that preheating action causes the next series of fuels to ignite quicker and quicker and quicker. So as it rolls up a mountainside or up a hillside, that's how fires grow very quickly, upslope. Versus downslope, it can't, imagine when you hold a candle. If you hold your finger over top of the candle, you burn yourself almost immediately, right? Because the heat air rises. But you can hold your fingers right underneath that wick, and it takes a little bit of a while before you can feel that heat. Same thing applies to a fire that's trying to burn downhill. It burns very slowly downhill because it can't preheat those fuels as quickly. That's how topography influences fire. Weather, huge variable denominator in fire behavior, which we're going to talk about. And you'll see fuel again. So fuel is the common denominator for starting fires or altering how a fire behaves once it starts and grows. And if you change the fuel, you change the behavior of the fire. Let's talk about weather real quick though, before I talk about fuel, because I need you to understand that drought conditions and prolonged drying effects have a huge impact in terms of how we communicate hazard to all of you and even my firefighters. When you get drought conditions, and that's what this yellow indicates, these are days, each line is a day. Back in July of 2012, I just pulled it because it was a really good example in 2012. You got about 14 or 12 days of drying trend. So we'll call it a drought conditioned event. Before it got to the red stage, red is problematic control. It's going to be a day where we have escalated fire growth and we're going to be challenged on suppression. There's definitely there's burn bans in place on this red day, right? To reduce the amount of human-caused fires so we could just deal with the lightning-caused fires, to try to reduce 22% of them so we could just focus on the 78 that we know are coming. That's why we have burn bans and burn restrictions in place. We got 5 mils of rain, and all of a sudden the phones start going off the hook, to lift the burn ban, to why is it still on place, right? But the thing is there's 3 different classifications of fuel, and I'm not going to get crazy. You see, there are a lot of numbers on this chart, right? It's my job to understand all of them very detailed. But there's 3 classifications of fuel. There's fine fuels, which are your small blades of grass, your pine needles, your leaves. Then there's medium fuels, which are anything up to about the size of your finger. And then there's coarse fuels, so anything greater than your forearm. Those different fuels dry out at different rates. A blade of grass will go from full saturation in the morning to combustible by 1 o'clock in the afternoon if you had a day like today. So if you imagine you went out to a leaf pile, a brown leaf pile in your yard this morning, and you poured water on it, by 1 o'clock today, it would have been dry enough that it would have combusted. So that just puts a picture in your mind for leaves. If you took in consideration wood debris up to about the size of your finger, it can take up to a couple days for that to dry out, if not longer, with that same amount of water, because it holds that water. It doesn't evaporate as quickly. Same thing goes for coarse fuel. It takes exponentially longer for that coarse fuel to dry out. Same thing happens when rain hits it. Only 5 mils of rain, it'll absolutely dampen those fine fuels, the grasses and the pine needles and the leaves, but it doesn't have enough penetration to dampen the coarse fuels and the medium fuels. So what happens is now it's been 2 days and all those fine fuels are dry again, and still all the medium and coarse fuels are still dry from the last period of drought. So in only 3 days, you're right back up, and in 4 days, you're hitting problem out of control again. That's why we leave burn bans in place, because on this day, if we had a crystal ball and we absolutely knew we were going to get rain back to back to back to back to back, you could look at lifting it. But we don't often know that. And we often have to look at the forecast for about a 7-day period. And like I spoke to before, I really don't know what's going to happen. So that's why burn bans aren't always lifted right away. If that helps ease tensions and ease concerns about it. Don't worry, we are looking very closely at the weather, and we want everybody to enjoy themselves when they come up and go to have their family activities, but we also have to be very careful about the amount of fire we have in the landscape to be able to respond to all of them adequately and save all your homes. Okay, that's weather. That's my spiel on weather. Let's talk about fuels. So fuels, forests burn completely dependent on their fine fuel arrangement. So you just learned that fine fuels dry out very quickly. They get hit by rain very quickly, but then dry out again. An initial fire spread is completely dependent on how many fine fuels there are present, so blades of grass or pine needles, and how they're arranged. So if you took your average forest stand here in Huntsville, Lake of Bays, you're looking at a boreal mixedwood. You're looking at maybe 25% conifer and 75% deciduous. So a conifer is a pine or a balsam fir or a spruce tree, and a deciduous tree is an oak, a maple, a beech, a broadleaf tree species, just for those of you that were unsure. You take that, and if I would have plopped a match down, if I was for criminal intent, arson, and I put a match down on May 11th of 2023 with a temp of 23, an RH of 34, a wind speed of 10, just a nice, perfect mirror image of today. Exactly what you've just seen today and you're going to see tomorrow. You would have had a spread rate of 4 meters per minute in that deciduous tree stand. Okay, that's pretty respectable. 4 meters per minute is pretty quick. That's we're working pretty hard to catch that. That's when you start getting those folks that have a campfire and it escapes and they try to put it out, but it keeps escaping them, and then they call the fire department and they come and then we put it out, and that's the textbook example of today and tomorrow. If you would take that exact same match or device and you plopped it in here and you ignited a pure conifer stand arranged like this with all the pine needles, all those fine fuels arranged vertically and horizontally in a fashion that allowed fire to continue to combust very quickly, you're looking at 9 meters per minute, very quick. Fire intensity class is 5. That's too hot for a firefighter to directly attack. You need air attack support to reduce the flame intensity to be able to put a firefighter alongside that fire. If you look in blowdown, same conifer component, but it's altered. It reduces, it's almost back down to half. It's only at 5 meters per minute. It's still very intense, but it's only at 5 meters per minute. Why is that? It's because the conifer pine needles aren't arranged continually like they are in the top right. They're blocked by large bowls of coarse fuels, those coarse fuel tree bowls, that when a fire hits it, it actually stops. And then it's got to trickle around that stem and then reignite the pine needles on the other side, and it slows that intensity down. It's called a micro barrier or a micro restrictor to fire spread. Kind of cool, eh? That's how that affects fire behavior. Still very intense. And to put a firefighter in that, you're putting a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of effort to be able to climb up to where that fire might be up in here. You know, a firefighter would have to climb up, carry all the gear over and up and all that. It's very difficult, very taxing, and it takes a lot of resource time requirements to be able to deal with that. But at least it's burning a little bit slower. Now look at standing dead grass, and I hope this number sticks out to you, and I hope this is something that you learned that you might not have known before you came in tonight. But standing dead grass, what we have outside actually right now in the springtime, is our highest hazard and most danger to my firefighters because of how fine the fuel is. Blades of grass are much finer of a fuel than a pine needle even. And when a fire is started here, you can look at 24 meters per minute because of how little time it takes to preheat the next blade of grass. It grows exponentially quicker. And that's something that we have to be very careful with in a fire agency as well as for municipal firefighters. Now, when this grass is all green, when it's grown up and it's lush and thick and full of moisture, it's the exact opposite. It's actually a safety zone. That's where we would retreat to if a forest stand like this was burning later on in the summer. We would look for these as safety zones. Kind of funny, eh? So it all depends on the moisture of the fuel and the moisture of the air that drives fire behavior. Does that connect some dots now? Yeah, cool. I see a lot of people like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I'm glad. That's why I do it, because it doesn't take much to make sense and you can make a career out of it. Just joking.
Sorry.
It's good. Yeah, go ahead.
The controlled burn was dry material. So how do you stop that from spreading like that?
Great question. It's predetermined boundaries. So the predetermined boundaries, we know exactly how big we want that fire to be. And if I wanted to burn a size of a grassland the size of this room, what we do is we mow down a barrier with a brush hog or a mower, and then we also have it charged with water. So a crew, a suppression crew we call it, goes along the edge and nozzles it real quick. It only takes about 10 minutes to nozzle about the perimeter of this room. And then we'll, for the sake of that plot, is actually testing the ignition devices for like arson to be able to track and be able to investigate them to make sure that we know how they started and how fires grow and whatnot. So they are actually plot point source. But typically we do line source ignition, which is with a drip torch, or even what you'll see on TV. But they changed the narrative on them, but they're called aerial ignition devices, and we use them a lot. We use aerial ignition devices a lot on large scale burns, and it's basically a drip torch. Looks just like that torch from a handheld, but it's much bigger, and it's on the bottom of a helicopter. And that's how we use them. We don't always just use them for prescribed burns by any means. We also use aerial ignition devices and handheld ignition devices for fire suppression from containment barriers. Because when those fires were too intense, I wish I could back up. That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it. Think back to that water bomber slide, and you've seen that really aggressive fire growth, right? If air attack happened to not be available, which I'm not saying there won't ever be, hopefully it always is, but if it's not available, we only have one other option because we can't put firefighters on that fire's edge. So we have to look at ignition operations. And the way we look at ignition operations is you would look at the next lake over, or the next stream, or the next road, and you would light a small fire, and the way that the large fire draws in air, because it needs air to combust, it drafts itself in, even if it's burning towards place, it'll still draft in air. It'll actually suck that lower fire that we start ahead of it into it, and when they meet, they dissipate, because there's no more fuel to burn.
Sorry, burn.
Yeah. That's how we use ignition devices to fight fire, fighting fire with fire. Make sense? Thanks for asking that question. Yeah. Yep. That's not taken lightly by any means. There's a lot of approval processes that even I have to go through to make sure that that's going to be conducted safely and effectively and efficiently in our best interests, but it works extremely well, sorry. Yep. So, what do we do to protect ourselves and to protect homes and communities and infrastructure? We look at fuel because that's the only thing we really have the power of dealing with at this time in hand. And we look to fuel to treat it through FireSmart Canada's messaging. So FireSmart Canada is a national program. It's world renowned. It's used from Australia to New Zealand and everywhere and into the States. They call it FireWise down in the States. They call it a few other things in the world, but it's essentially the same program. It teaches homeowners or community leaders, fire departments, and wildland fire agencies how to manipulate fuel to reduce fire intensity So as you don't have a huge wall of flame approaching homes, what you have is a fire that started, maybe it does get up in the big intensity, but as it gets close to a community, there's less fuel, less fine fuel, so it drops in intensity and effectively self-extinguishes before it reaches the community. And it's tried and true, and it works really well, and we're going to talk about it really quick. How am I doing for time, Steve? I'm still good. Oh, good. I still got 12 minutes. Hopefully I'm not boring anybody. Everybody's seeming to have fun, so that's good. So FireSmart Canada speaks to 7 disciplines. And first and foremost, they talk to vegetation management. Vegetation is fuel. Vegetation is fuel for wildland fire. We talk about development considerations for municipal planners and federal planners when they're looking at building new subdivisions. So there's certain new criteria that a new build has to meet to be able to be plopped into a forested area. We do public education, that's key. So it's one thing for Kenny to know how fires start and spread, but that doesn't do us any good when I'm, dealing with my 3-year-old and I can't go to the fire. You need to educate the public, right? So that's tonight's endeavor. And then legislation. So legislation, of course, for prevention, which is restricted fire zones and whatnot. In terms of you shall prune a cedar tree or a spruce tree right next to your home, there's no legislation that says that. There is legislation that says you shall not because of a species at risk that might call your area that you live in home, and you can't alter the habitat of that species at risk. So we have to follow those laws. But anything we can do to reduce fire intensity in conjunction with those laws, maybe there's shoreline bylaws for a municipality for the health of a lake. Because if you remove a lot of tree canopies along the side of a lake, you expose that lake to the sun, which heats it up faster, which gives you algae blooms and all those aspects. That's why there's shoreline bylaws in a lot of places. We can't prune any of those conifer trees, but there are other things that we can do, even though we can't do that. Does that make sense? So there's things here, especially in Southern Ontario, that I'm going to speak to that might not necessarily apply to you because you have another governing legislation piece that you have to abide by. And that's fine. I'm going to give you some options. Interagency cooperation is key. Without Huntsville, Lake of Bays, and you folks having me here, then it doesn't mean anything, so that's great. Cross-training and emergency planning, we do a ton of, which came back to your question in terms of not just cross-training with local departments, but also international agencies. So last year, I was asked to, but I couldn't make it, but it doesn't matter. I won't get into my stories. But there's a lot of American training that is put on in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and they ask us to come down and do that. And Ontario sends folks, Alberta sends folks, Saskatchewan sends folks, anybody, even France, New Zealand, Australia, they send folks, and we do cross-training events all across the world sometimes. So that's pretty cool. If you know anybody that's interested in becoming a forest firefighter, it's a pretty fun job. Yep, go ahead.
I'm curious about that because I'm from Ottawa, but I live in Bracebridge, and Ottawa and Bracebridge are 2 very different places for fighting fires. Is there like I may not explain this well, but is there like a base standard for training? Because in Ottawa, they certainly would not be dealing with as many forest fires as they would in Lake of Bays or Bracebridge, for example. So would the training they receive that they maybe got in tandem with a Muskoka Fire Department, would it apply, or do they do it differently? Would they not be involved in that? How does that work? That's
a great question. So the answer is I was actually just talking to 2 chiefs. I'll name them, Chief Bill Bell and Chief Nathan, I can't remember Chief Nathan's last name, starts with an A, Nathan Adams. Anyway, over the city of Ottawa, because I deal with all of Southern Ontario. They train to the exact same standards as Huntsville and Muskoka Lakes, the SP 103. It's a wildland firefighting basic course that all firefighters use and take to train to the exact same level that even Australian firefighters take. That training, even though they're in Ottawa, they have a very different forested landscape, like you mentioned. They're still very volatile in terms of grass fuels, and they still have a lot of wildland fire on the landscape, even though they don't have a forested area nearly as much as you have here in Muskoka. They just have different types of fires, like agricultural fires and stuff like that. But they train to the exact same standard. Yep. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah.
Yep. It's called the SP 103. And anybody can take that. It costs a bit of money, but anybody here can take it if you wanted to. It's from fire1.ca. So embers and sparks, I want to talk about in terms of structural ignition. Oh yeah, let me back up a second. How are structures lost from wildland fire? Structures are lost from wildland fire in 3 ways. Direct flame contact, extreme heat, and embers and sparks. Not a fun stat, an unfortunate stat that's interesting, is a better way to put it, is that embers and sparks attribute to about 90% of structures lost in Canada every year from wildland fire events. So you might be thinking back to the way Kenny was speaking about fire and how it grows and how it starts and what it needs to grow and start. When you're looking at a forest that's burning, let's roll back. Let's think about the last campfire you had. You probably had some sparks shooting off from it, right? You had little sparks and whatnot that came off. Those sparks were probably dying out about 10 feet or so in the air, and they would disappear, right? In a wildland fire event, you can compound, there's a lot more fuel burning, like pine cones and whatnot, that can get lifted up in that convective action. Those burning pine cones, if it's dry enough, will stay ignited, and they'll stay lit, and they're an ember that gets transported ahead of the fire, and instead of going out, they stay lit, and they land on fine fuels ahead of the fire, and that's called spotting. We have spotting on fires all the time. It happens a lot. That's what we train for, that's what we look out for in suppression. Those spots don't always just land in the forest. Unfortunately, they often land on homes. So if you can think back to, there's some, unfortunately, very detailed images from Fort McMurray, from Ember brand storms and whatnot. And if you want to, check it out on YouTube. Actually, you know what? Next time I deliver a presentation, I'm going to put them right in here to show you right now. But it shows all the embers and how they go aloft ahead of that forest fire and how they accumulate and collect. So when an ember travels aloft ahead of a forest fire, or even a bonfire for that matter, if you threw on your Christmas tree and it had pine cones in it, you would see that. You'd see that lifting action. You'd see those embers continue to burn and land. Maybe not continue to combust, because hopefully you got a green FireSmart yard and they just die out. But you'll observe that. And when those embers land, they need a receptive fuel bed to continue to combust. If there is no receptive fuel bed, they won't combust. It's absolutely not practical for us to remove every receptive fuel bed in the forest. It can't happen, right? But it is possible for us to do this on the home itself. So by simply removing any buildup of pine needles, small twigs and leaves and debris on the deck, under the deck, against the home, on the roof sills or in the eaves troughs, those are ember beds. And what happens is the sparks would land on those, catch those dry components adjacent to the home on fire, which then causes more heat, which then transfers that heat to the structure itself. Does that make sense to people? Kind of like paper to kindling to large logs. You can't light a large log on fire with just a match. You need the paper, you need the kindling, and then you need the large log, right? To continue that process. So here's a myth bust. Like, log homes are very fire safe. As long as they're all kept clean of fine fuels. Vinyl-sided homes are much more hazardous in terms of receptibility because of the little soffit phase. You know how vinyl sometimes peels and you get all those nooks and crannies out from the soffit? I'm sure you all deal with it. I deal with it myself. Yeah, it cracks. Those little holes and whatnot, just like it lets snow get into it, it lets embers get into it ahead of a firestorm for us across Canada, and that's how those homes are lost, unfortunately, compared to a log home, which the embers just bounce off and burn out if the person fire-smarted the home. Does that make sense? Still, it can still bounce. Actually, I'm going to show you a picture. It can still bounce off vinyl and burn out and die, just as long as there's no cracks and whatnot that lead those embers to be able to collect and transfer their heat. Okay, enough about embers and sparks. I think I nailed that one. Direct flame. That's what a lot of people think causes structural loss, right? When you thought about, probably before this presentation, you probably envisioned forest fires happening and a fire going right up to a home and then burning that home down. That only attributes to about 8% of structural losses in Canada, very little. Extreme heat attributes to about 2% of structural losses in Canada. And that's because when you think about homes at risk in Canada, it's not necessarily the subdivisions and whatnot that have brand new double pane tempered glass windows. It's usually structures like outpost camps, fishing lodges, hunting lodges, things of that nature, seasonal cottages that are far out in the way that have single pane windows. Those single pane windows, they shatter much more easier than a double pane window that's tempered. When they shatter, it actually reverts right back to embers and sparks. That opens up the inside of the home, the carpets, the sofas, the cushions, the curtains. Did I say curtains? Anyway, it doesn't matter. All those embers then go into the home and start to combust the home from the inside. Make sense? That's how homes are lost from that aspect. So that's 3 ways of which the homes are lost. FireSmart Canada, through studies done in the Northwest Territories back in 94, 98, and 99, developed recommendations on distances and what to do around a home to A, live on a forested landscape, but B, maximize the chance of your structure surviving the passing of a fire. So if you do anything at all after you leave here tonight and in your endeavors, in your personal endeavors throughout the summer, just focus on the immediate zone. If you make it as fireproof as possible, AKA just cleaning the gutters, cleaning the roof lines, the valleys, the dorms, anywhere where pine needles and debris can collect, you remove that, you just saved your home in 90% of occurrences if it was to be overcome by a wildland fire. Once you do that, you can expand outwards in the intermediate zone and follow FireSmart Canada recommendations, which there's books here, so make sure you grab a book and take it with you. There's tons of different little tips for each zone, and you can apply that there. Then if you even have the ability to move beyond, if you own the land and you have permissions of the land to go beyond that into the extended zone, you can treat the forested area around the home. But Kenny's not telling you, oh, did you get a call? Or is that EMS?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I was just trying to determine if I believe or not.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, fair enough. Well, you can go if you need to. I can handle it. What was I going to say? I can't even remember now. Oh, it's okay.
Extended zone.
Extended zone, that's right. So, yes, where I was getting at, please do not go back and cut down your neighbor's spruce trees. Just because Kenny said it'll increase your structural chance of surviving. That's not what I mean by any means. Work within your limits, and if you don't own the property but your neighbor has very hazardous trees or a fire hazard or whatnot, it's open to a conversation, an easygoing conversation. You can take multiple books if you're that concerned about it and give them to them. But the essence is if it's their property, they don't have to do anything. Same as it's your property, you don't have to do anything. This is just tips and tricks to help hopefully save your home in case we can't get there in time. Because unfortunately, I've been there much too often in my humble career. Yes?
So all of what you just mentioned, that's something that, most of us, I'm sure, can do on our own. But when it comes to things that we can purchase, I think of like a sprinkler system. I've seen pictures of homes that have probably a bigger sprinkler system than just having 1 or 2. It's all around the house, and in forest fires, it was completely protected or mostly protected when the area around it was burned down. I'm not sure if it was just sprinklers, but the picture mentioned that. How helpful is it to have a sprinkler system that may go around your entire house or in certain areas?
That's a great question. Yep, it's a great question. You jumped me because I talk about it, but we'll bring it up right now. So the sprinkler aspect is great, but it's outside of Kenny's fiscal responsibility. Nothing against my employer, don't tell my bosses, but I can't afford to sprinklerize my home, right? That's just the fiscal responsibility abilities I have. I'm sure a lot of you are in the same boat. If you can do sprinklers, by all means, you go right ahead and do it. The essence is sprinklers can only wet down what they can hit. And sprinkler limitations are often vegetation that blocks the radius of which a sprinkler is rotating to be able to wet down what's on the other side. So if you had a deck, for example, and this happens to me, unfortunately, quite a few times in my career, if you have a buildup of flammable material underneath that deck, and that deck's got outdoor carpet on it, and it's not allowing or it's shedding off the water, and it's still very dry underneath, I don't mean to, anyway. They had a lot of money put into values protection setups for those homes, but didn't do any fire smarting. There were buildup of flammable materials underneath the deck. The embers landed underneath the deck, still caught the home on fire. The essence is if you remove the fuel, you increase the chance of that structure surviving with or without sprinklers. The sprinklers absolutely help. And that's what the fire department and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry deploys when we see a wildland fire approaching a community. We deem it too intense to suppress. So then we look 5, 10, 15 sometimes 20 kilometers ahead of a fire, and we establish values protection, sprinkler kits or exposure protection kits on the homes, on the communities, on the community infrastructure, and we use that to our advantage when time permits. Yeah,
So
does that make sense?
sprinkler system is kind of a false sense of security.
It still works.
You still need to put in the effort to make sure
Yeah.
the other things are taken care of.
If I had $1,000 at my disposal and I needed to protect my home from wildland fire, I would spend the $1,000 on pruning and reducing all the fine fuels around the home before I spent it on a sprinkler. That's myself personally, but each to their own. Yep.
So I'm new to the area, and I'm sure there's other people here. I have a couple acres of land with wooded around the clear cut area.
Okay.
And my wife and I get into this argument, should we clean up underneath there with all the trees that have fallen in the branches? Or should we let it be natural?
That's a great
I saw
question.
your argument there about the fallen trees burn slower per meter than cleared out area. But, so I don't know what the right thing to do is in that area.
Oh, that's a great question. So you'll see here that they talk about out to 10 to 30 meters out. And FireSmart Canada's messaging, grab a book before you take off too. And the FireSmart Canada's messaging really, it goes beyond 30 meters by all means, but 30 meters is that mark where if you had a mature jack pine forest, which in Canada, that's the forest that produces the most intense amount of heat that we can have in a forested type in Canada because of its arrangement of fine fuels and medium fuels and the way it burns. When they did these test plots in 1994, 1998, and 1999, what they found was even with a fully stocked mature C3, it's called, it's a mature jack pine forest. If the home was 30 meters from that and they lit it on fire and they let it overtake the test home, it survived it based on that distance. Any more closer, it would succumb to the amount of radiant heat and direct flame contact that you'd have for 90-foot flame depths, like I showed you on that picture. But 30 meters out protected the home, and that's why they stick to it. So anything greater than 30 meters from your home, I humbly suggest not really worrying too much about, just worry about the more integral parts of the home.
Taking the dead branches and dead trees from underneath there.
That's a lot of work for a little protection. But it will ultimately reduce the fire intensity, but there's better time spent on other things, in my humble opinion. Yeah, if that helps ease concerns. Oh yeah, okay. There you go. Well, you can blame it on me. Yeah, Kenny said. So you might think that those pictures and everything are real cute, because they are. FireSmart Canada, you know, they redid these here in 2021, 2022. But I'm here to tell you it actually means something in real life. So I took this photo in 2017 of a home I was responsible for. So I had a 3,000 hectare fire rolling towards a community, and I had limited resources, so I had to protect critical infrastructure and all those good things, right? We couldn't get to this section of a community in time to protect it. It was left on its own. This homeowner practiced FireSmart. FireSmart was still a thing prior to 2017. It's just changed. All the images are more updated now and all that good stuff. Same core messaging, same priority zones, immediate zones, and all those good things. They removed the fuels in the extended zone by pruning conifer trees and spacing them out. So as they reduced the amount of fuel that a fire could travel from conifer to conifer to conifer and continue, by reducing it and pruning those trees, they removed the fuel, which forced the fire to the ground. You can see in the distance, it was a full crown fire that came through and went right by the home. You can see that it was all torched off back there, full crown fire. By spacing them out, no fuel, no fire. So the fire forced to the ground. And of course, it continued to burn, pretty good intensity, fire tested class 3, decent intensity, up to the home through the intermediate zone. It didn't build intensity, it just continued to die as it got closer to the home. When it got to the home's area, the immediate zone, it snuffed itself out. So that saved the home from 10% of the fires, right? Direct flame and radiant heat. But you might be asking me about the ember transport, which would have said 90% of the structures were lost, and you're absolutely right. But at the time in 2017, I had a lot of stuff going on. I took a picture of this because it was amazing what they did. They protected their own home. But I didn't go up and take the pictures of all the burnt out embers that were embedded into the vinyl siding. So that home was absolutely plastered, absolutely covered, and had buildup of black, burnt out firebrand buildups all in the corners, in the corner of the deck, on the deck, under the deck, in the windowsill corners where it was white. They would have had to be replaced because they were, they turned brown and whatnot and ugly from the firebrands being there and burning them. But there was no fine fuels there. The firebrands collected and they burnt out because there was just coarse fuel. There was no fine or medium fuels to transfer their heat to. So they eliminated the fine fuels on that home, and they saved their home. Yeah, just on their own. Yep.
A lot of the fuel that we use up here is propane for heating. How does that fire affect that in terms of going through an area?
That's a great question. So we hold propane tanks to the same standard as the dwelling itself. So we talk about putting them on a non-combustible surface like patio stones, or if you want to get really fancy, you can do the limestone or granite, rock and whatnot, and have them on top of that, and keeping them free of any flammable debris right against it. Reason why is because the way propane tanks are a danger is when they get heated up. And when they get heated up, they have a relief valve that because it builds pressure. And when that relief valve pops and it shoots out the pressure of propane buildup in it, that relief valve, when installed correctly on a home, is pointed away from the home, and it's like a flamethrower, and it blows it all out. So propane tanks should be away from the home, so when that happens, if they do get heated up and they blow off and they catch on fire, they're shooting that tiger torch effect or a flamethrower effect of fire away from the structure. And then also, if you don't have a buildup of flammable debris under the tank, right beside the tank, it won't get to that stage anyway. So we teach them, we talk to them about the same standards as the home itself, of having non-combustible and then working your way out to reduce the amount of fuel around them. Does that make sense? But they're absolutely fire safe as long as they're maintained and they're in good condition and they don't have combustibles.
Question of that.
Yeah.
A lot of people use generators as well, and they're hooked up to the propane.
Yeah.
And there's obviously connection pieces that go to the propane. How does that affect it?
That's a good question that I've actually never had before. I get the propane one a lot, but I don't get the supply lines question very often. So the supply lines are an iron line, right? At one time you might have seen copper lines and whatnot that went into homes, and they're not safe. That's not the code anymore. The codes, as long as they're installed properly with iron line, suffice the passing of a wildland fire at a low intensity. If you had a buildup of a crazy amount of firewood on that line, and that pile of firewood or your woodshed caught on fire and exposed it to an immense amount of heat, it probably would fatigue it and cause it to break and crack and spew propane. But that would be a bad case scenario. But to code, it can withstand a low intensity fire. Does that help answer the question? Yeah, good question. Excellent question. Thanks. And that's that. Oh, so in the book, it's got tons of things to speak to. Oh, sorry, I'm way over time now. I'm 10 minutes over time. I'm gonna speed her up. Everybody's like, I want to go home and watch my show, Kenny. So immediate zone, check out the books. Tons of little things that you can look at, from windows and doors to gutters, to treat the home to make it more fireproof. If you're like me and you have no money to spend on it, all this is your time on a Saturday with the kids cleaning the gutters and making sure it's free of flammable debris. If you got time and you can, and you got cedar shake roofs, I humbly, more firmly actually than humbly, suggest you replace the cedar shake roof with asphalt or steel roofs, because a cedar shake roof is just like kindling. I've lost a lot of homes to that, unfortunately, in my career. Here's examples of not so good ideas for you. So if you fit one of these criteria, like cedar shakes with fine fuels on it, that'll absolutely be lost. Buildup of firewood. I know we live in Canada. I know it's very convenient. I grew up on a farm, right? And the farmhouses where I grew up and the dairy farms all had their firewood stacked against the home. But it's not fire safe. So now I get to go back and tell everybody I grew up with not to do that. But try to avoid that. Move the firewood pit or your woodshed away, about 5 meters, 10 meters away from your structure if you can. Same thing goes for cleaning the decks. Just simple, keep up on maintenance. It's okay to have a wooden deck. A lot of people get into non-combustible decks. That's fine. If you have $148, I think, for a board, which Kenny doesn't. I got $16 per board when I replaced my deck. That's fine, because when you think about a brown pressure treated deck, it's very tight and it's pressure treated, right? If you drop the match on that, yeah, it probably blackens it in that little spot, but the match dies out before it transfers its heat. When you have an old deck that needs replacing because you're going to fall through it, what else, besides falling through it, it's also very porous and got lots of splinters and those little woody fiber hairs that stick up. If you drop the match on that, it's probably going to weasel its way into those crooks and crevices and cracks and those little fiber woody hairs and cause it to combust. So when you're about to fall through your deck by walking on it, it's a good time to replace it because it also makes it fire safe. Same thing goes for your roof. When asphalt shingles are very fire smart, embers will land on them and burn themselves out. They won't go through an asphalt shingle like a steel, same as a steel roof as compared to a cedar shake. But when your roof starts to leak because the asphalt shingles are curled up like this, and you see the snow collect underneath them, that's the exact same thing that'll happen in front of a firestorm or a firebrand storm in front of a forest fire. Those embers collect and they will cause that structure to be lost. But at the same time, your roof's probably leaking. So anyway, as long as your house is maintained to adequate standards for living in the Canada climate, you're probably in pretty good shape. Yep, go ahead.
I'm looking at that photo of the deck, and I see that there's bushes right beside it.
Yes.
And a lot of people have bushes around their house to make them attractive. We have ranger bushes in the front. And I'm thinking about those right now when I look at that phone.
Yep. So my humble suggestion is deciduous bushes are great. And deciduous bushes are those broadleaf bushes, like bushes that leaf out in the summertime. When you have juniper, unfortunately juniper is very fire indicative. It's very fire prone. Yeah, let's just go with that. Juniper is very flammable as compared to like a hostis plant. So if you like, change out your juniper or your conifer ornamental shrubs with something that's not as flammable. And I have a landscape guide too, to make sure you grab it before you go home. It's got all kinds of FireSmart plants on there that you can look to replace those juniper with. Yeah, good, thanks, catch. Good catch. I don't usually talk about that one. You're paying attention. Intermediate zone, sorry, I'll get going. It's as fire resistant as possible, but we live in Canada, we live in a forested landscape or grassland landscapes. You gotta have some vegetation there, right? I think we can all agree on that we live where we want some vegetation or privacy and whatnot. That's fine, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with your mature red, white pines because they're self-pruning. When you look at a red pine or a white pine that's 20 feet tall or whatnot, and those lower branches are starting to self-prune, that's that tree's natural cycle to become fire resistant. When you look at a Norway spruce or a white spruce or a black spruce, it doesn't have that effect usually. It's usually in a yard with full sunlight. It's laddered fuels. It's got a full vertical arrangement of branches from the floor of the earth right up to the top of the tree. If all you gotta do is remove 2 meters, the bottom 2 meters of that laddered fuel or mid-story fuel, and a fire will trickle underneath that conifer tree, just like I showed you in the picture from 2017, and just be low intensity. It won't engulf that whole tree. So all you gotta do is prune the lower branches of your conifer, and you can absolutely keep your conifer. Yeah, I hope that finds a happy balance for you as well. If you do need to change it with anything, change it with a deciduous tree species if you can. That'll increase its chance of not being lost from a fire when a fire comes by. Make sense? Yeah. The book talks about how to make proper cuts and pruning and spacing the trees, just like you've seen for 2017. That's getting into the extended zone. If you got the time, that's great. This is just spruce and conifer trees or immature red and white pine. If you treat them to this standard and separate them from 3 meters apart, the fire can't catch the next tree on fire in that mid-story or crown level fire arrangement. It'll still trickle underneath them all. And if they're pruned, they won't climb up. And if that tree does catch on fire, it won't catch the next tree on fire from crown to crown. Does that make sense? Anyway, kind of fun. Take a book, you'll learn about it. This is what it looks like. This is a non-fire safe, non-fire smart, if you will.
That's what I want.
Here you go. Yeah. And here you got a FireSmart area within 30 meters of a home. How's that? Does that offer you some support? Within 30 meters of the home. Yeah. Oh boy.
What's your phone number, Ken?
Nobody give him my business card. So back to your sprinklers. You're asking about sprinklers. They absolutely do work as long as they can wet down what we're trying to protect. But if it's stacked with conifer right adjacent to it, it can only protect so much. And this is actually kind of a bad photo, but anyway, it was a full crown fire right up to the side of the structure. The sprinkler did protect it. If there was no sprinkler, it would have absolutely been lost.
That was kind of the picture that I saw. It was a fire surrounding a home, and it was right literally in the middle, and a circle around it. But it said it had a sprinkler system, it protected it a little bit.
It would have, absolutely. And it does. But the essence is that's not going to solve all your problems. You can solve more problems if you don't have the fiscal abilities to install sprinklers. You can do just as good of a job by removing the conifer component around the home to reducing its intensity before it gets to that structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep. Yes?
I know we're almost out of time, but just one question as it relates to evacuation.
Oh, yeah.
So what are the conditions and the timelines or lead times or things that you see where you give people the heads up that it's actually time to evacuate? Like, do you have lots of time? Do you sort of,
I'd like to say you would have lots of time. So it depends. It's actually very situational. Whew, that's a very good question. And unfortunately, no, it's a good question. I would like to speak to it. It's completely situational on where the fire starts and where the homes are. If the fire starts 20 kilometers away, and I know I'm not going to be able to suppress it, I know it's going to hit those homes, we got quite a bit of time usually, probably upwards of 4 hours at a minimum, to be able to notify the people, have the OPP on site, have the fire department organized, and start doing evacuations as we're starting to put up sprinklers. That's in a best case. That's how it usually works out for us. There are circumstances, and you'll absolutely see it on the news, like Fort McMurray, for example, where the fire's already on top of it. Well, anyway, we'll talk about that one anyway. The fire's on the community, and its folks are evacuating. That can absolutely happen as well. And it just depends on the wind speeds, the flammability of fine fuels, and where the ignition occurred. So, hence the importance of burn bans. When there's burn bans in place, because we're trying to reduce the amount of human-caused fires, the stat is 88, it might be 89. Anyway, let's just say 88. 88% of human-caused fires are within 3 kilometers of a community. Those lightning-caused fires that I showed you on the map of Ontario, 78% of them, Ontario's a huge landmass. Those lightning fires might be 10, 20, 40, 50 kilometers away from the nearest structure. But the essence is when we put burn bans in place, it's very important to follow them because we're trying to reduce a fire starting right adjacent to community infrastructure and then causing losses of structure. Unfortunately, a lot of folks that don't follow those inadvertently burn their neighbors or their own homes down in the process. Unfortunately, in my humble time as an officer and a captain. 2 books, grab them before you leave. And check them out. If by any means, if I run out, which I shouldn't, but if I do run out, firesmartcanada.ca, tons of good resources. Actually, there's a free online course, FireSmart Canada 101 course. You can take that and learn a tremendous amount. Ultimately, I wanted you to see a home like this and know that that's not fire safe now, and you can turn it into this. It's the same home, but now it's been fire smarted. So if you can do that, you increased not just your home's chance of surviving, but you also increase the chances of my success to protect it with sprinklers and fire trucks and access, as well as Steve's team, because that all helps. And there you go, firesmartcanada.ca. Also, if you want more information about the fire season, when fires are happening and what the conditions are, absolutely check with your municipality that you reside in, but you can also check the Ontario Interactive Fire Map, and that's the ministry's map. So the ministry will plot real time the fires that are reported to us. If I'm the incident commander flying around in Hell Attack 1 that's on alert right now, and I put in the GPS and I database it, it populates real time in that. It's pretty neat, pretty cool technology.
I'm going to jump in and say thank you very, very much, and then I'm sure if there's any more questions.
Yeah, we're happy to stay, but if you want to go,
leave.
yeah, it's absolutely okay. We're not.